That'd be awesome.
Sure.
I can start if you like. I'm an alumni judge from Washington State, if that gives you information. 3 years of policy, 3 years of parley experience. I'm going to know the terms that you're using. I'm also a coach for my club, so I'm familiar with the conflicts and the resolution. As far as what I'd like to see, I really love impacts, and I really love really telling me why I need to work on one side or the other. I'm going to be a net benefits judge. Stock issues are awesome, but I'm not going to, and Harrison Point very strongly is a disadvantage. I'm going to be a net benefits judge. Let's see. I am a rather responsive person, so if I'm smiling, it means I like a point. I think it's a good point. If I'm frowning, it's because I either don't understand what you're saying, or in my own humble opinion, I think you're incorrect. So read off of me and what I'm saying. That'll explain how.
Sure. My name is David Ray. I'm from the East Coast, from North Carolina. I've been involved in team policy and debate for a little over 6 years. My daughter was in it, my son is in it, he's here competing. I am a judge trainer. My wife is a coach, I'm a judge trainer, so for all the tournaments and events, I train the judges. I grade you all. What I like to do is that we are a stock issues club. So we like to see a complete case. We want it to be topical, we want to see inherency, we want to see that it's significant, and we want to see that you have a solution. So at the end of the day, basically, you're presenting a problem, you're presenting an issue, and you're going to give us a solution. So we want to hear that your solution is viable, doable, workable, and it's going to achieve whatever goals you want it to. Likewise, your job is to refute that and to, counter it. We like seeing a good clash with evidence and logic, balance it out. So at the end of the day, whoever is convincing, and the burden of proof is on the affirmative, since we're here to hear what you have to say. So you have a harder of the two jobs. The thing I don't like to see, and I've seen in tournaments, and I hate to say it regretfully in this tournament as well as some other ones, I do not like to see people get petty or snide or start to be a little condescending or arrogant towards the other team. That will come back to hurt you very harshly in this round. So before we go any further, I want to congratulate all of you for making it down rounds and to being here today. So now it's like you guys are the best of the best, ladies included. You're the best of the best. So it's getting down to a crucial time now. And so good luck to all of you. Hope you do well. And so I'll just look for a good, well-balanced debate.
Thank you.
And I'm from Colorado, and I just like to see clean arguments. I like to see the responses to those arguments, and I like it well organized.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. And if the negative team is ready, 8 minutes on the clock. And my judges? Ready, Katie? Then let's begin. I start a fire, put a pot of water on it, and tell the children I am in the middle of preparing something. In reality, I have nothing. This is a quote from Mariam Sai, a citizen of Senegal and a mother of 9. Her country receives food aid from the United States, and yet she is still one of the 821 million people who suffer from chronic hunger. At least 9 million of these people could be saved right now if the US reformed its regulations on shipping and procurement preferences. And that is why my partner and I stand resolved that the United States federal government should substantially reform its foreign aid. To provide some clarity in the debate round, we provided the following definition of foreign aid from the Victoria Williams Encyclopedia as, quote, the international transfer of capital, goods, or services from a country or international organization for the benefit of the recipient country or its population, end quote. With that in mind, let's look at the status quo. What is the current situation in the food aid program? And you can tag my lone observation as food sourcing and cargo preference requirements. According to Vincent H. Smith from the American Enterprise Institute in May of 2017, quote, first, the food sourcing requirement stipulates that USAID and USDA source more than 90% of all our food aid from producers in the United States, instead of procuring food aid from cheaper sources located closer to the emergency zones. And second, the cargo preference requirement mandates that the government ship at least half of that aid using US flagged vessels at shipping rates that are 46% more expensive than for aid shipped at internationally competitive rates, end quote. Put simply, judges, US aid agencies are forced to buy more than 90% of their aid from US farmers, whose farms are thousands of miles away from the farms that actually need it. And and at least 50% of that aid is required to be shipped on US flagships no matter what other options there may be. Unfortunately, there are harms to these needless requirements, and my first harm you can tag as starvation. According to Tom Murphy from Humanisphere in 2014, he says, quote, a total of $17.9 billion was spent on food aid between 2003 and 2012 by the United States. Of that $17 billion, $9.2 billion was spent on just getting the food to the people in need. A comprehensive investigation by USA Today and Northwestern University confirms that US food aid is by far the most inefficient and expensive food assistance delivery system in the world, depriving sustenance to potentially millions of people who desperately need it and may die without it, end quote. Then according to Brett Schaefer from the Heritage Foundation in 2018, quote, for every tax dollar spent on US food aid, a number of studies estimate that only 35 to 40 cents is actually spent on the commodities themselves that feed hungry people. The rest is spent meeting agricultural requirements instead of using market-based assistance, which would be more cost-efficient and faster, end quote. The impact of this harm, judges, is starvation and death. And just to back it up, I'd like to bring up a piece from Chris Barrett, who's a law professor at Cornell University. He reported before the House of Representatives in 2017 that, quote, a conservative estimate is that we sacrifice roughly 40,000 children's lives annually because of these antiquated food policies, end quote. That leads me to my second harm of the status quo, hurts local economies. When we hand out our free food, we're bankrupting local economies because the reason is simple, who can compete with free? According to Brett Schaefer from the Heritage Foundation in 2013, he's quoting the Food and Agriculture Organization. They say, quote, the empirical evidence shows that food prices almost invariably fall in local markets immediately after a free food aid distribution, end quote. And then James Bovard from the Wall Street Journal provides some examples of how this has happened historically. He says, quote, in 2002 and 2003, a deluge of food aid in Malawi caused local corn prices to plunge by 60%, according to the GAO. And Haitian farmers were similarly whipsawed after the US and other nations bombarded the island with free food after the 2010 earthquake there, end quote. The impact of this harm you can tag as hurts local markets, because we cause farmers to go out of business and undermine our ultimate goal of putting the countries back on their feet. That's why we provided the following criteria. Greatest efficiency of service. Whichever team's proposal will deliver food aid most cost efficiently and quickly to deliver it to the most people should win this debate round. Our plan consists of 3 mandates. Immediately eliminate the nearly 100% US source food requirement and the 50% requirement on shipping preferences in the Food for Peace Act Title II. Mandate 2, for the next fiscal year, the US will purchase its food aid in the recipient country when and where possible, as specified by our LRP qualifiers taken from Professor Chris Barrett's study. And thirdly, the US will reallocate any money saved from the original budget back into Food for Peace to be used for purchasing and distributing more food. And the affirmative team reserves the right to clarify these mandates. That leads us to the advantages of this plan. The first advantage you can tag as greater efficiency of service. According to Vincent Smith and Ryan Nabil from the Council on Foreign Relations in 2016, quote, taken together, these sourcing and shipping policies have contributed to a situation in which only 40% of the funding for Food for Peace was actually used for food in the most recent year for which data is available. In comparison, Canada, which requires neither Canadian sourcing nor cargo preference, spends 70% of its aid budget on the food commodities, end quote. And according to Professor Chris Barrett's testimony before the House in 2015, he says, quote, Congress should enable US aid agencies to deliver aid as quickly and cheaply as possible. Eliminating cargo preference and the requirement that the government source food from US producers could save US food agencies $350 million per year, which is 30% of our entire food aid annual budget, according to studies by the GAO and George Mason. These kinds of savings would be used to deliver food aid to an additional 4 to 10 million people, and the effects on national security would be negligible, end quote. The impact of this advantage, feed more. Instead of wasting our money on slow ships, we can actually use that money for procuring food in the local countries and feed more people. Our second advantage you can tag as economic development. The second mandate of our plan requires that when possible, the US should buy food aid in the struggling countries themselves, because by buying food from local markets, we're supporting them rather than competing with them. According to the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy in 2012, quote, purchases made closer to areas of need would go beyond the emergency response in helping local farmers in developing countries grow their production capacity, end quote. And we have data from the GAO and multiple NGOs out working in Africa that also support this point. But the impact of this advantage is that we put the country back on its feet. Because by eliminating these requirements and requiring the purchase of local food, we're supporting local businesses and achieving our true objective, stopping starvation and developing economies. In conclusion, I want to leave you with one last quote. Mark Green, the administrator of USAID, declared that the purpose of foreign aid is to end the need for its existence. We as the affirmative team believe that saving 40,000 child lives, feeding 9 million more people, and supporting local businesses is the perfect way to do this. We pass our plan and people like Miriam Sai can start a fire, put a pot of water in it, and truthfully say to their children, I'm in the middle of preparing something. Thank you, and I now stand open for cross-examination.
So your first observation point talked about food sourcing and the CPFA. About the food sourcing, is that in Title II or All A?
This is Title II specifically, and we have the entire bill of Title II if you'd like
Of
to
course.
see it afterwards.
So then CPFA, what % of foreign ships are we currently using?
We're using, I believe it's about 40%, so there's 50%, since 50% is
So we're
required to be
allowed-
on US
right.
ships, out of the 50% that's on the free market, 4 out of 5 times we're using foreign ships.
Okay, so essentially currently, we have this opportunity to use as many foreign ships as we can, and we aren't?
Well, think about it. We only have 50% on the market, and yet 4 out of 5 times we still use
Okay.
foreign ships out of the free market availability.
Why don't we use it 5 out of 5 times?
The US, because it's often not the wisest option. Sometimes US ships are the closest option, but
Okay.
we're saying that most of the time foreign ships are more cost effective, and we
Sure.
shouldn't have that requirement, we
Sure.
should have flexibility.
Okay, so your first harm talked about starvation, and you talked
Yes,
about
sir.
a waste of money. Would you agree that solving this harm is based on action that USAID takes?
Solving which harm specifically?
Just really like all of the harms that you presented, would you agree that that's based on
We
action?
believe that saving this money would be happening by freeing up the need for spending this on the
Okay.
long supply chain. And by cutting that supply chain and mandating that we buy it in local
Okay.
countries, we're not spending this money on slow
Okay,
ships.
you talked about 40,000 lives.
Yes, sir.
Specifically, what actions must USAID take with this new flexibility to save these lives?
Yes, this is specifically because by freeing up this extra money and by buying in local countries, we're supporting the markets themselves, and then we
Okay.
also have more money
So
to
let's-
give to these people, which is why we're able
Sure.
to save more lives.
Let's talk about it. So your specific position is that we're going to save the market by subsidizing the market with governmental cash?
No, sir, that's incorrect. What we're saying is we buy food from local markets and help them
Right.
improve their quality, and that will get the country back on its feet, so that ultimately we can end up pulling out of the country. That's our
right.
goal.
Doesn't that guarantee, though, a market when it might not exist?
Right, our second mandate says that when possible, we recognize that this doesn't occur in every single foreign
Okay.
country. So when possible, and our data takes this into account with
Sure.
the 40,000 lives
So-
and 9 million.
Okay, so your plan specifically talked about these, I believe it was 16 different requirements for LRP use. Can we see those?
16 different requirements?
I don't know exactly what the number
Oh,
was.
I'm sorry, yes, I can
Sure.
get that for you.
Awesome. And then your first advantage talked about greater efficiency. So
Mhm.
is it your position, it talked about that there are certain contributors to this inefficiency. Are
Yes,
these
sir.
the only contributors?
These are the primary contributor, and you
But
may
there are
bring
other
up,
ones,
you
right?
may bring up later that monetization is another one, but we have specific data talking about specifically cargo
Okay.
preference and
Why
sourcing.
specifically are these mandates not eliminated?
Because they're inefficient, and we have evidence saying that
Now, why aren't
lobbyists,
they currently being eliminated?
because Congress isn't willing, and because lobbyists have been pushing it and bringing false information into
Okay.
Congress.
Thanks, Dr.
Yes, sir.
Can I see those?
Yes, this was taken from our study, which we can, by Chris Barrett and his recommendations,
Great, thank you.
which we can provide you with the whole study if you wish.
Starting prep time, we'll be prepping our own prep.
Yes, hang on, sorry.
Right, I've got it.
we see a copy of the one you see?
I guess, right. No further question on the meeting? 3 minutes and 28 seconds remaining. Okay. Are my judges ready?
Yes.
Okay, then let's begin. Ronald Reagan once said that government does not solve the problem, but simply rearranges it. And when we look at the affirmative team's case, we see that they're not going to solve the problem, and that there'll actually be disadvantages for actually enacting their plan. So before we begin, I want to have one clarification point, just so we're all on the same page. One program. One program. So what the affirmative team is doing is they're saying that we have to source all of our food from the United States. However, it's important to remember that's talking about one program in particular, namely Title II. Now, Title II under the Food Aid Program says that all U.S. food all food within Title II has to be bought from the United States, and we'll get into other programs and their methods as well. With that being said, let's go into some inherency points, or basically the status quo and why there really isn't a problem currently. My first point under this is high quality currently. High quality food currently. And this is from the Government Accountability Office in 2011, quote, that U.S. and foreign government officials, vendors, implementing partners, and recipients with whom we met said that the commodities procured for food aid programs are of high quality and are generally delivered to beneficiaries in sound condition, end quote. So it's important to remember that we are sending good, high quality food currently. Now, this kind of reminds me of a time with my dad. Now, my dad likes to get his hands dirty and work on cars. Now, he's not a mechanic specifically, but he likes to tinker around with our cars and make them run even better. I remember one time we had a vehicle that ran perfectly, it was perfectly normal, but he tried to make it run even better. And what happened is he started tinkering around and he broke something. He didn't know what he broke, but now the car didn't run, and we actually had to take it to a mechanic to actually fix the problem. So before we actually jump and make all these changes, we need to make sure that we're not breaking a system that is already good. Let's go down to my second point, however, which is other methods used. Other methods used. And this is important to remember, is that actually LRPs and cash-based assistance, which is what they're mentioning as actions that they want, are actually currently being used in the United States food aid. And this is according to Samuel Ockford in 2017. Quote, recent government reforms have introduced some flexibility, notably by allowing more spending on cheaper, non-U.S. food, end quote. So we will actually do that, but let's actually talk about what USAID says themselves. And this is from 2017. In February 2017 from USAID, quote, USAID is now among the largest cash providers of food assistance in the world. It initiated the Emergency Food Security Program in 2010 to support local and regional procurement of food, as well as cash-based transfers and vouchers to address food security needs in emergency contexts. Using international disaster assistance funds, this program is used when USAID's in-kind food aid cannot arrive in time or other forms of assistance are more appropriate due to market conditions. So we actually only use LRPs when? For two main reasons. When our normal aid can't get there fast enough, or in two, when the market conditions allow it to happen. And that's important because if you look at kind of both of their harms, it kind of applies to both. They're saying that the main reason starvation happens is because we're not able to get the food there fast enough. But we have these other methods that solve that. Then hurts local economies where we actually use LRPs when the market conditions allow. But lastly, let's talk about increased funding. Increased funding for other methods. Basically, these other methods have been introduced, and there has been an increase in funding for these other methods, and away from the in-kind food aid from the United States. Again, from Samuel Oxford in 2017, quote, "But there have been progress. For instance, U.S. contributions to WFP in cash, not in kind, increased from 12% of Washington's funding in 2012 to 44% for funding last year." So a 12% to 44% increase in funding from 2012 to 2016 from non-U.S. food means. And that involves a bunch of other different methods, such as LRPs, cash-based assistance, cash vouchers, etc. So we're actually going away. So what is the impact? Irrelevant, basically. That their case is talking about a program that's becoming more irrelevant as time's going on, and that the status quo is always solving. Let's go down to the criteria that they introduced, however, and I don't have a problem with being more efficient. However, I would just remind us that the affirmative team's job is simply to affirm the resolution, right? They have to show that there's a problem that they're fixing, and basically you all know the details for that. We're not saying that's a bad criteria, we're just saying that there are other things you have to look at as well. Let's go down to a significancy point, and this is specific to the shipping requirements. The shipping requirements are insignificant, and this is according to West Coast sailors in 2017, but they quote some data from the U.S. Maritime Administration and recent Governmental Accountability Office. And this is 2017 quote, "From the GAO and U.S. Maritime Administration's findings show that hiring Americans to ship food for peace cargoes add just 1% to the program's budget, less than $20 million annually to support a $1.7 billion program," end quote. So it's important to remember food for peace, that's the Title II. It's 1% of the budget, which is very small. So it's not a big problem. The using American shippers is not very significant. They're saying it's really expensive, but it's not. It's only 1% of the entire budget. It's only $20 million compared to the $1.7 billion program. And as we always see, we can get the food there faster when we need to. Let's go down to some solvency, however. And my first solvency point is barriers to LRPs. Barriers to LRPs. And this is according to Dr. Charles E. Honnerman in 2010, quote, "Several recent studies have evaluated the timeliness and cost effectiveness of LRPs versus commodity donations and conclude that LRPs in sub-Saharan Africa costs substantially less than shipping food aid from the United States to Africa. The studies point to risks associated with LRPs, including lack of reliable suppliers, poor infrastructure, weak legal systems, donor funding delays, and quality considerations that could impede the efficiency of LRPs," end quote. Now, it's basically saying the impact is that it's unstable. Basically, we do use LRPs, but it's not a silver bullet, right? Because we're working in countries where there is a weak infrastructure. Why are we giving food there if they have food? Because a lot of these countries don't have a lot of suppliers. Hence why we're having to give them food. We do use LRPs, but we still have to get food from the United States from time to time. Let's talk about the economic development advantage that they have specifically. And my response is economic disadvantage. And this is basically just a simple economic principle applied, is that right now within Title II, we spend money on American farmers and on the American economy. Now this is important because according to August Strainberg, who wrote this macroeconomics book, he talks about the bathtub theorem. And the bathtub theorem is basically just a simple economic principle, which is that there are leakages and injections into an economy. An injection is when a government puts money into an economy. And what do we see from our current aid, Title II, is that the United States government buys food from American farmers. Hence, the government is putting money into the economy. Now, if we spent all that money in foreign areas, we wouldn't see the money going to the U.S. economy. The impact is basically a hurt U.S. economy. It's basically just a basic economic principle that if the money's not going to the U.S. economy, then it's harmful. So in the end, we see that there's not an inherent problem, it's not significant, it won't solve, and there's disadvantages. Thanks. Now I stand ready for cross-examination.
All right, if everyone is ready, 3 minutes on the clock.
Yes.
My judges.
Yes.
Let's begin. Congrats on making it to Night Talk at round 4. That's awesome. I just had a quick couple of clarifying questions. Would you agree that the goal of foreign aid should be ultimately to end it, to pull out of these countries? Could we agree on that?
Not exactly, because the thing with food aid is that there's emergencies, so like natural disasters and famine, so.
Okay, but as far as developmental aid, you would agree that it's not the best option to give food indefinitely to these countries. Could we agree on that?
in a general basis on aid, which could include some forms of food aid, yes, you do want to.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that U.S. aid increased its LRP program back in 2010. Is that correct?
In 2010, they created a program in 2010.
Okay, thank you.
And that they're still using.
Thank you for clarifying that. You would agree that we brought up evidence in our 1AC saying that Title II is U.S. aid's biggest food aid program?
We're not saying that it's not the biggest, but what we see is that there's a shift from not using that program. As we mentioned, 44% of the budget was used.
Okay, thank you. Would you agree that U.S. aid is the ultimate U.S. expert on food aid?
The U.S. aid
Yeah, the U.S. aid organization.
are the expert on food aid. I mean, I say they give a lot of food aid, so.
Okay, thank you. Could I have the evidence on irrelevance for LRP and how that's already being instituted?
Yes, I brought up a couple, I think.
Okay, that would be awesome.
There's this one.
And then you brought up some evidence on U.S. shippers as well. Would you mind handing that piece of evidence to me real quick?
Wait a sec. Oh, it's on this page.
And then would you agree that our plan regards fixing the long supply chain and spending money on U.S. ships rather than just hiring U.S. shippers?
I mean, you're hoping for a change in cargo shippers.
Right, what I'm just asking is our plan deals with far more than just hiring U.S. shippers. Would you agree with that?
But that's usually what's the expensive cost, is that American shippers are more
Thank
expensive
you.
than foreign.
Could I have the evidence for the cost in sub-Saharan Africa and the hurt markets, please? For the weak infrastructure, rather?
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Would you agree that our second mandate both eliminates the 90% LRP requirement, but then mandates that we use it when and where possible?
Well, as I would say, is that we're only using it when and where possible or when it's needed.
So 90%, even though it has, actually the piece of evidence you said is that it's far cheaper in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a 90% requirement which eliminates flexibility. So would you say that this is still using it when and where possible to the max efficiency?
Well, we always showed evidence that showed that we're actually increasing our use of LRPs currently, and that we're using these other programs to fund.
Okay, thank you. And then your last disadvantage was about how the U.S. economy is hurt, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, was your point that the disadvantage is that U.S. farmers and the U.S. agriculture organization is being hurt?
Well,
Am I correct in saying that?
basically, the United States with Title II, they spend money from America into the American economy.
Okay, so
It's
we're hurting
farmers.
American farmers by eliminating our plan. That's what you're saying?
American farmers and the American economy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, starting affirmative prep time at 5 minutes. Stopping affirmative prep time, 3 minutes, 10 seconds remaining.
All my judges ready?
Yes.
My plans are beginning from the clock?
Yes.
Great, then let's go ahead and get started. It was Anne Frank who once said, "Hunger is not a problem. It is an obscenity. How wonderful it is we need not wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." And I love this quote because it really epitomizes what we can do right now, today. By passing our plan, we can start to improve the world. Now, in this second affirmative speech, I'm going to be responding to the negative concerns about our plan, and I'm going to be furthering impacting exactly what LRP is and what our plan actually does. Because LRP, I know, it can be a little confusing at times. So with that said, let's get into his concerns with our plan. But I first want to bring up, though, that in CrossX, he admitted that USAID was pretty much an expert on food aid because they are the biggest donor of food aid in the US. And judges, simply put, USAID actually advocates for our plan. They agree with us. So they actually admitted that the expert in food aid actually is for our plan. All right, with that out of the way, I want to get into his clarification about the program. One program, he talked about the Food for Peace. And I'm going to be responding to this and also his disadvantage too about other methods used. So in this response, he talked about how he talked about there was one program, and we're talking about Food for Peace only. But my partner read a piece of evidence in his first speech talking about how USAID was, Food for Peace was the USAID's biggest food aid program. This was on the Council of Foreign Relations, and it said Food for Peace is USAID's biggest food aid program. So Judge, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because Food for Peace is still using this 90+% requirement on food sourcing. And so when they're saying, well, that's only one program of food aid, there are other programs, but Judge, simply put, this is the biggest food aid program, and we need to make sure that this is as efficient as it can possibly be. He also talked about how his disadvantage too, that there are already LRPs being used in other programs, but Judge, my response to this is contradiction. When he talked about how in clarification one, that there was one program for Food for Peace, he said that program had a 90+ food sourcing requirement, and yet now he's saying that LRP is actually being used. But Judge, we're not talking about other LRP, we're talking about Food for Peace, and Food for Peace is not using LRP because he actually admitted to this in when he said that they were using the 90% food sourcing requirement. In his harm one, he talked about high quality and talked about how the U.S. has a higher quality than all of these other nations that we would potentially be sourcing from. And my response to this is twofold. My first response is that is of LRP helps quality of food. LRP helps the quality of food. One of the main objectives of LRP is to actually help the quality of food and help the farmers who have this food to get their quality standards up. Let me read you a piece of evidence from the USDA that said this: each LRP agreement requires implementing partners to submit evaluation performance and monitoring plans to the USDA and provide semi-annual performance reports by April and October. Essentially, Judge, what LRP does is they go in and they help the farmers. They get down, they get their hands dirty so they can help the farmers actually bring their quality of food up. So the impact of this, Judge, is that LRP helps the quality of the foreign food increase. My second response to this is this: foreign people's food is better for them than the United States. Foreign people's own food is better for them than the United States. Judge, when they bring up this argument that the U.S. has better quality of food, so we need to give them our food aid. Well, Judge, the U.S. has better quality food than a lot of different countries. So is it their contention that every country that has a lower quality of food than the U.S., that we should be giving them food aid? Simply put, that's not a logical argument. We want to help these countries get back on their feet. And we can do so by implementing our LRP, because ultimately, foreign people's own food is better for them than the United States. So they also talked about how in their disadvantage 4, I believe, about the industry, the shipping industry is not important to the food aid, and it's only, I believe, they said like 1% of the food aid. But my response to this is empirically denied. Judge, my partner brought up 2 sources in his last speech talking about how in Harm 1, out of $17 billion spent on food aid, we are spending $9.2 billion on shipping costs. Again, empirically denied. He brought up another source from Brett Schaefer talking about how 35 to 40 cents of every taxpayer's dollars is only that is actually spent on the food aid. All the rest is spent on the transportation costs. Again, empirically denied. They also talked in their Solvency 1 about LRP, barriers to LRP. They brought up this evidence of timeliness and how that LRP is timely but not always the best choice. And my response to this is simply put, Judge, if you read their evidence, their actually evidence, you read this, says that LRP is more cost effective and more timely. That's what the evidence said. The evidence is actually advocating for our plan. They also talked about how he referenced back to his other harm of higher quality and how the U.S. has higher quality than the donor countries and the countries we're going to be sourcing from. And again, I've already responded to this, but LRP actually helps farmers get back on their feet. The LRP actually helps farmers bring up their quality of food. So lastly, he talked about the bathtub theory. He talked about the economic principle and how we need to keep the farming industry we need to keep helping out the farming industry. And I have 2 responses to this one. The first one is he actually brought up no evidence of the farming industry and how much we are buying from the farming industry for foreign aid. But and that being said, I will be bringing up evidence. And my second response to this is that is of approval of the farming industry. We actually have the approval of the farming industry advocating for our plan. Let me read you this quote from Zippy Duval, the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation. It said this: the reality is that while our country provides the lion's share for global food aid, it represents only 0.2% of total U.S. agricultural output. Modernizing food for peace will save millions of lives without undermining our farmers, who will continue to be a key component of the Food for Peace program. The farming industry, judges, are actually advocating for our plan because they say, quote, that it will save millions of lives without undermining our farmers. The impact of this, judge, is their evidence is simply put not true because they actually didn't bring up any evidence. Ultimately, judge, we have the evidence on our side. We have the support of USAID, the people they said were the experts in food aid. We have the support of the farming industry, who they say is going to be hurt, but the farming industry realizes that we're going to save millions of people's lives. Ultimately, judge, we have the opportunity to start improving the world right now by passing our plan. Thank you.
So let's talk about the impacts of actually if we passed your case. So how much could we expect the United States to source food from the United States if we enacted your case?
Okay, so essentially it's on a case-to-case basis, as the study brought up and as our LRP qualifier said. But ultimately, there's a lot of people out there, a lot of food sourcing availability out there. And one of the things is like, one part of the country that we're giving aid to might have food in one part of the country and yet not in the other part of the country. And what LRP allows us to do is to go in there and actually move that food from one part of the country to the other part of the country, so we're getting the whole country back on their feet.
But we don't know how much more LRPs we could use than we do currently.
Oh yes, so basically Canada actually uses LRP and they're able to spend 70% on, the.
70% of their budget, correct?
Yes.
And how big is their budget compared to the United States?
I do not have the exact numbers.
Okay, so let's talk about so you would agree that there are other programs that use LRPs within the United States system?
You have not brought up any evidence, so I could actually not
Okay,
debate
cool.
that.
And
And
then-
once you do, we can debate that.
Okay, and then you would agree that, you talked about USAID advocating for LRPs. You would agree
Yes.
that evidence does say that they use LRPs as well, correct?
Again, you did not bring up any evidence, so I could not agree to that, and once you do, then.
Actually, do you have the card up here with us?
What?
Did you have the card with, about the USAID
Yes,
advocating?
here is a USAID fact sheet, and it says that, right here, that the USAID reform will allow us, the US to reach 2 to 4.
Okay, cool, cool.
per year.
Anyways, let's go on next. So you talked about the quality of food. Can I see that piece of evidence?
Yes. For
And-
LRP?
Yes. And then and then you mentioned the point after that, talking about how these people need to eat local food and not food from foreign sources, correct?
Yes, because simply put, we don't want to be giving them our food the whole time that the country is in existence.
Okay, cool.
We want to be able to
Now-
let.
Sorry, but you would agree that a lot of the food that we give is given in emergency context, correct?
No.
No?
Also, you brought up no evidence for that
Okay,
again,
cool.
so, no,
Um,
but no.
So are you saying that there are local foods for them to eat currently?
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, yes, so as I was saying before, LRP allows the countries and allows the US to food source, food from farms at different parts of the country.
Yes.
Also, people may not actually have access to that food and to those farms.
Yeah.
And additionally, they may not even be able to afford the food that those farms have.
Yeah.
So that's what LRP does.
Let's get to one more part really
Yes.
quickly. You talked about the $9.2 billion for shipping costs,
Yes.
correct? You would agree that the evidence says it costs $9.2 billion to get the food to the people. Not just shipping, but the whole process to get the food to the people, correct?
Is the transportation cost.
Of everything, not just shipping, correct?
I don't have the exact piece of evidence
Right.
that looks at the transportation cost.
Thanks.
Do you have our evidence about LRP use?
Yes, we do.
Starting program? Minute 17? I don't know what's that.
Is it just a small card?
Yeah. This is this card.
Let me make sure that we don't have
It's okay, it's fine.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay, we'll keep it now.
Yeah, I'll keep looking for it.
Definitely. Alright. Well said. Well, White in his last speech talks about more broad issues, exactly with their plan. What I'm gonna be doing is looking at the specific harms and advantages that they presented, as well as the plan to show that reformation is not justified. Starting off with their first harm talking about starvation, there was a little bit of confusion in cross-examination, specifically about LRP use within the current system. Now, I would like to point out, there are many programs within USAID. Title II is the biggest, but there are others that we currently use, including the Emergency Food Security Act. What this means is that when they say that that we're not using LRPs, that's not really true. In fact, according to USAID in March 28th of 2019, it takes about 3 to 6 months for food commodities to reach their destination from the US, depending on the type of commodity and how it's processed. For example, bulk food commodities such as sorghum and wheat takes less time to reach hungry people than processed food commodities such as a corn soy blend. In times of urgency, we purchase food locally and regionally, which gets to hungry people 11 to 14 weeks faster. The reason why this is important is because their whole entire idea behind their case is that we need this more flexibility. The problem is that we already have flexibility in the status quo. The impact is that they haven't actually proven that their plan is a necessary action. The second response is no action specified. Again, no action specified. This is specifically against this idea of 40,000 lives. Within the evidence, they didn't actually specify an action that needs to be taken. And this is going to be a big theme within my speech. This idea that we can increase flexibility, but if no action is taken within this flexibility, then we're not going to see these advantages, and we're not going to solve the harms. If I have freedom and I do nothing with it, then nothing happens, nothing changes. And they must prove that USAID is going to change its actions, and that's something they haven't done so far. And in a second, we'll see how that won't happen. But let's go on to the second harm, talking about how it harms the local economy. I'd like to actually bring up a quote by Ronald Reagan when he said, "Government's view of the economy can be summed up in these few words. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. And this leads to two responses. The first response is that they're subsidizing a market. The problem is that their idea here is that we have government within this market, so let's fix it with government within the market. When historically that doesn't work. What we need to do if we really want to solve this problem is take the government out of the picture, especially a foreign government. My second response is that it's continuous aid. The aid that we give in food aid, specifically with LRP or food aid, is continuous aid. What this means is that we're going to continually subsidizing this market, creating an artificial market, and that's never good for an economy. This idea that we're going to fix it by more government action truly doesn't make sense when we look at the history of economies. Let's move on to the plan. I want to look specifically at this idea of cost effectiveness, and I actually have two responses. The first response is evaluations is rare. Again, evaluations is rare. This is according to Amanda Glassman, Sarah Ross for the Center for Global Development in 2018. And they said, while impact evaluation is rare, cost effectiveness analysis is rarer still. USAID's operational policies suggest staffs might want to analyze cost effectiveness as a part of its program development design, but it's not but it's not a requirement and is infrequently done. The reason why this is important is because their whole entire plan is based on this idea that the government is going to take these actions and look at the policy that they're presenting. They're going to analyze it and see which is more cost effective. They're going to analyze it and see the impact that it's going to have. That's not a common practice within USAID. What it shows is that there's not actually proof that the USAID is going to change its action. Remember, flexibility is not important with that action that follows it. So my second response is that this action is already done. Within the piece of evidence that we can't find, it's kind of disappeared. But what it specifically says that Wyatt read is that we use LRPs when markets can handle it and when there's a time of emergency, when they are hungry. This is exactly the point that we're trying to make. All of these actions that we say, or this flexibility that doesn't exist in the current system, really does exist in the current system, and that's what the evidence says. Let's move on to their first advantage, talking about greater efficiency of service. My one response, I actually have three responses, sorry. The first response is this advantage is based on action. Again, the advantage is based on action. Again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but it's really important to note that this whole entire advantage is based on the fact that the US will specifically take action. And I think this is really important whenever we look at the amount of foreign ships that we're currently using. If foreign ships are so amazing, if they're the greatest thing ever, then my question is, why aren't we using 50%? We have this requirement, so let's use all the foreign ships we can. They said themselves currently we're using 40%. This is important because that means that in the status quo, right now we have flexibility. There's two impacts. The first one is that it shows their plan is not necessary because we have that flexibility in the status quo. The second is that they haven't proven that an action is taken. If right now we've met the maximum foreign ships that we can currently use because they said that action is justified, then that means that we're not going to change our action when it comes to CPFA, therefore deeming their plan an unnecessary plan that doesn't actually solve the problem. A lot of their harm is that it's going to actually cost more money because of the shipping requirement. But there's no reason to believe we're going to use more foreign ships, especially when we're already using the maximum that we can, if we take into account the fact that there's still this 10% flexibility within the status quo. But my second response is lobbyists hinder LRP use. This is actually something that they talked about in cross-examination, but let's bring some evidence into the round. There's two subpoints. The first subpoint is agro-businesses pay lobbyists. Again, agro-businesses pay lobbyists. According to USA Today, quote, to protect their interests, Didion, which started producing corn soy blend in the early 1990s, has been paying lobbyists since 2005, spending $220,000 since 2010. Bunge spent almost $2 million over the past 2 years lobbying for American-made food aid products, including corn and soy blend. Lobbying records show. But then my second response, or my second subpoint, is the special interest block food aid reform. Again, special interest block food aid reform. According to Claire Provost in 2012, together agribusinesses, shipping companies, and NGOs form what I've called the iron triangle of special interest, blocking reforms of the controversial in-kind system. The impact is, again, that their whole entire plan is based on action. But there's millions of dollars given to the government saying, let's not use LRPs. So they can take away flexibility, but they can't actually prove that action is going to be taken under their plan. Like I said before, this proves a couple things. First off, it proves that their plan is unnecessary, but secondarily, it proves that their plan is not actually solving. But let's actually look to the economic principles. You can cross-apply my responses, but my second response is 78% more expensive. This is according to Seafarers International Association. And they said, in fact, The U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, own data reveals that traditional Food for Peace aid is 78% cheaper per ton of food delivered than the cash transfer approach processed by food aid reformers. The administration has not disputed this, and the difference can be significant in addressing global hunger. What it says is that when we use local markets and when we use foreign ships, exactly what their plan is increasing, that it's actually 78% per ton. So this is really important whenever we look at the status quo. In the end, we see that they haven't actually proven that action is going to be taken under their plan. We can have flexibility, but without action, flexibility is useless. But they also have shown that their plan is not really inherent. It's not really necessary. They haven't shown that there's a problem in the status quo. Why? Because what we actually see is that LRPs are currently used in times of emergency, and that criteria is often used. But also that they're not solvent because they don't even look at impact evaluation in the current system. Their plan is unnecessary and not solvent, therefore I would ask that reformation is not justified. Thank you, and I'm ready for cross-examination.
Are all my judges ready?
Yes.
And this is hot, great, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, great speech. I just have a couple questions for you. The first one is, could I have the evidence you read on the Argo business response?
Yeah. The lobbyists?
Yes. And,
Yes.
I think we gave your partner back the evidence.
Excellent, thank you. Here you go. Yeah, I understand these cars are kind of hard to find.
So which one was it again?
It was both of them. I read both of them for the agro
Okay,
business. Yeah.
thank you. So also you talked about how Food for Peace is using LRP currently, but you would agree that you said that Food for Peace was actually having a 90% food sourcing requirement, correct?
Well, the problem is that doesn't take into account how many LRPs we can actually use. And this is really important, that actually according to the evidence, Food for Peace budget is decreasing, and then the emergency food program that we currently use LRPs with is increasing.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, but you would agree that Food for Peace not only deals with emergency, but also non-emergency?
Right, but what I'm
Yes,
saying is
okay.
that when market conditions apply, that's when LRPs can use. That's what the evidence said.
Okay, so you also talked about how we would have no change, but you would agree that our mandate is actually saying that we would use LRP?
Your mandate is saying that based on certain conditions you can. There's two problems. First off, we have lobbyists saying don't use LRPs. Secondarily, USAID specifically
Okay.
doesn't actually take impact evaluations that much.
Okay, but you would agree that all the evidence that we've read saying LRP is gonna work, LRP is gonna save this much money, LRP is gonna save this many lives, has actually taken into that account, correct?
I don't really know if that's the case. Can you rephrase the question?
Okay, so basically all of our evidence, especially that we read in the 1AC and
Okay.
also the I brought up, talks about, and you had the USAID fact sheet, talks about how eliminating those requirements, and if we do, instating that LRP would save 2 to 10 million lives, would save so many hundreds of millions of dollars.
So
a
that
year,
takes
would
into apply that USAID is going to take action. I don't know if it necessarily
No,
does.
that's not what I'm asking. Sorry, maybe I'm coming across as confusing. But
No, it's
what
fine.
I'm asking is, you're making
Yeah.
the claim that's saying that we aren't going to be able to solve for anything, but our evidence takes into that account. Would you agree?
No, because what your evidence says is first off, that we increase flexibility, and then I believe the exact wording is, and that could allow something. It also says that flexibility with efficiency could increase these things.
Okay.
That involves an action that can't be proven.
So you're saying that our evidence says could?
Yeah, well, it
Okay.
says could allow based on action. And what
Okay.
I'm saying is that all the evidence in this round points to the fact that USAID will not take this action under your plan.
All right. So you also talked about subsidizing a market. Would you agree that that's actually happening currently?
Kind of, but then you're not fixing it. Either way, there's government interaction,
Yes,
and
I
that's
see
the
what you're
problem.
saying. Yes, we will answer that question.
Sure.
You also talked about how cash transfers, can I have that evidence talking about cash transfers?
Sure, cash transfer specifically
Yes,
with USAID.
and you would agree that we're not actually talking about cash transfers?
That's a part of the LRP program.
Okay, interesting.
Starting negative part-time? minutes and 8 seconds remaining. Okay, are we ready?
Ready?
Okay, then let's begin. Since this is the first rebuttal, which means I just have 5 minutes to respond to the arguments brought up in the last affirmative constructive. So I'm going to go down the flow and respond to their points. Now I just kind of want to have 3 points basically on what we're saying. Basically just to kind of summarize what the negative team has been saying throughout this entire debate round. The first is that we're already solving the problem. Basically that we're always solving the efficient servicing, basically their advantage 1. By 1, according to USAID themselves, they say that other forms of assistance are more appropriate to market conditions, or when U.S. in-kind aid, food aid can't arrive in time, we use LRPs and cash-based assistance. So we already can use this in times of emergency. Their own case says in their advantage 1 that we should allow more flexibility for emergency context, but what we see is we already do. And we already help with economic development in those other countries because we do use LRPs. The second is unknown impact. We don't know what an impact is going to change with their case. And the last is disadvantageous. You're not going to be supporting American farmers and shippers with their case. This is kind of a broad economic principle. You're not going to be supporting American shippers if you spend the money elsewhere. With that being said, let's go to some direct refutation. First off, they said that the USAID advocates for the program. One, they had this basically fact sheet about USAID. And they said that USAID said that if we reformed, that if we used more LRPs, that we could save like $125 million to $185 million per year. This is actually an interesting fact because this what the food aid reform that they're talking about is from the Farm Bill in 2014. It's talking about this 2014 coverage. Now, let's actually talk about the Farm Bill way back in 2014. And this is from Trivat Garg in 2015, quote, "And thanks to the important reforms in the 2014 Farm Bill, we have additional flexibilities in Title II programs to complement our in-kind food aid with local and reasonable purchased food." Basically, yes, back in 2014, they said that there was a problem, and we actually increased flexibility. And actually, if you look at the evidence, it doesn't say to change Title II. It says to change other programs to increase our LRP use. It doesn't advocate for changing Title II. Let's go down to contradiction about one program. Basically, my response is one program changed. The response wasn't that there was only one program used, but they're only changing one program, and that there are other programs used. We mentioned this in our case that in 2010, USAID implemented the Emergency Food Security Program. And actually, let's talk about EFSP really quickly. So the Emergency Food Security Program was implemented in 2010, according to USAID in 2017, to support local and regional procurement of food. Interesting fact, according to the Congressional Research Service in 2018, they say funding has increased for the EFSP that uses LRPs. Quote, cash-based EFSP assistance has grown into approximately 10%, from 10% of total international food assistance in 2010 to 30% in 2016. So a 20% increase from 2010 to 2016 of this LRP program. Basically, let's go down to a next, since there's a lot of arguments that they brought up. They talked about how LRP helps increase the quality of food. My response is 1, not reliable currently. This is saying that if we help the farmers in those countries, that we can increase their quality of food, but that's not talking about the current problem right now. But 2, used. We still use LRPs currently when market conditions apply. They talk about helping the farmers in other countries. My response is help farmers in the United States. And my second response is both. We help both. We help American farmers when we have to, and we help those other people when we need to as well. Is it they need to eat local food versus US food? My response is actually food versus no food. The reason we give them food is because they don't have good food security in those areas. If they had tons of food around, they could buy it. And that's why we send food from the United States. Why? Because we actually have suppliers who have food. And that's what the evidence was saying, is that there's an unreliable amount and lack of suppliers of food in these other areas. They talked about empirically denied. My response is we still use ORPs currently. They talked about the $92.2 billion. My response is total costs. Total costs not just shipping. Let's actually talk about that. That was in the harm one, talking about starvation. The quote is, $9.2 billion was spent on just getting the food to the people in need. Not shipping, getting the food from the people in need. So that includes the entire transportation process, not just shipping. We see it doesn't actually even mention shipping in this specific piece of evidence. It's just talking about getting the food from trucks to the ships, from the ships to the country, from the country to the people. And all that together combines it doesn't really link. In the end, we see that they aren't solving the problem, that the problem is actually already being solved currently, and there's disadvantages to actually solving the case. Thanks.
No prep time needed.
All right then, if the negative team is ready, 5 minutes on the clock. And my judges? Good, Katey? Then let's begin. Unfortunately, as I have to respond to 13 minutes of speeches in 5 minutes, I will be talking quite a bit faster, so please get your writing hands ready. If I am to understand correctly, the negative team's argument hinges on the fact that we aren't guaranteeing implementation of our plan. So I'm going to be spending a bit more time on that, but I would like to go through their other responses as well. First of all, they talked about how other programs use LRP and how overall we have these emergency programs that we're already using. Well, according to USA Today and data provided by Andrew Natsios, who's the former administrator of USAID, they say, quote, the journey of this food takes 7 months as the food moves from Midwestern fields to coastal ports across the ocean and then by truck or even donkey to its intended recipients. By then the food may be rotted or too late to help, end quote. So when he's talking about the $9.2 billion that's just spent on getting it to the people in need, precisely, that's our point. We're taking it all the way from Midwestern fields and bringing it across this extended shipping line that takes 7 months, according to the former administrator of USAID, and wastes this food. We also have data from an NGO that works over in Africa. They're called Bread for the World, and they estimate that our reforms would save $259 million per metric ton, and LRP gets the food there 2.5 months sooner. And you're welcome to see this if you would like. Next, they brought up there's no guarantee of implementation, and there's no guarantee that we even use other ships. Well, I'd first like to bring up our, you can tag my first response as CPFA guarantee. According to the Government Accountability Office in 2017, they said, quote, if CPFA requirements were not applied, 97% of food aid would have likely been awarded to foreign flag vessels, end quote. So you see here, according to the Government Accountability Office, they recognize that our ships are so often more expensive, and they found without these requirements, we will, the majority of the time, be shipping it on the cheaper option. And this comes because, according to USAID data, last time we cut these requirements, by 25%, we saved $108 million. This is from USAID. Last time we cut these requirements, and we're asking to cut it entirely. And my second response you can tag as second mandate. We are guaranteeing it because we're guaranteeing that when and where possible, as specified by our LRP qualifiers from this study, and you're welcome to take a look at this study afterwards, but this study took into account 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it concluded that LRP would be a valuable tool that does not disrupt local markets. These are actual countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and when they're talking about subsidizing market, my same response applies. You can tag my response as no evidence, and then Barrett's study. They simply use logic to say, well, since we're subsidizing markets and we're pulling out, there's no evidence. They didn't bring up any evidence about this, and we have evidence that will actually be helping the markets the majority of the time. Next, they brought up how evaluation was rare. You can tag my response as purpose of reform. Our qualifiers mandate that USAID representatives must be in the benefiting country and conduct cost-benefit analyses. So this is a problem with the status quo. We're mandating that USAID officials start to use the more efficient option, which is the entire purpose of our plan. We're trying to reform food aid. Next, they talked about how advantage was based on action. My response you can tag is other ships preferable. They talked about, well, why don't we use other ships the majority of the time? Consider it, we have 50% on the free market. Out of that 50%, we use foreign ships 4 out of 5 times. So when available, we already use foreign ships 80% of the time, 4 out of 5 times. That shows how USAID prefers to look at it. My second response There's no evidence, again, for this advantage. They were simply saying we can't guarantee it. And again, look at the plan. Our action is mandated. That's the entire purpose of reform. Next, they brought up how we're paying lobbyists and special interests are blocking this reform. My tagline for this is exactly. This is why it hasn't been passed in the past several years, because lobbyists are blocking it. They brought up the fact that Bunge, which is an agriculture organization, has spent $2 million on this. And we have another quote from the Center of Public Integrity that says USA Maritime contributed a total of more than $750,000 to members of the current House of Representatives in 2012 just to block these types of reforms. My second response to this is your choice. I don't see any lobbyists here, Judge, and we're acting as Congress. We have no lobbyists blocking us, and since this is the more efficient option, it's your choice to pass it. My next response, I'd like to point out that we're not passing cash transfers, we're simply passing LRP, local and regional procurement. Then they talked about hurting shippers. I have a letter from the Pentagon right here that talks about how it would only hurt 360 to 495 mariners, the merchant marine would still survive. And as you can see, by the still 90% requirement, we still use LRP the majority of the time. So because we do mandate change, and because there are no lobbyists in this room, I would ask that you pass the affirmative team's plan. Thank you.
Starting negative prep time. In this final speech, what I'm going to be doing is proving two things. First off, I'm going to be proving that the affirmative team's plan is unnecessary, and then secondarily, I'm going to be proving it's not solvent. I'll be doing that by responding to the points he made in his last speech, and then finally leaving you with two voting issues, which are that it's unnecessary and it's not solvent. So first, let's get into this idea that CPFA is guaranteed, and they brought up some evidence. I really have one response, and that's why are they not using all they can now? They said that it's going to change, but that doesn't really answer the question. Why aren't we using all of the foreign ships we can? They haven't answered that question. Why are we using 40%? Why not 50%? What it shows in the impact is that there is flexibility within the current system. Flexibility is the advantage that they're claiming, proving that their plan is unnecessary. Then they talked about, against this idea of market, he said no evidence, and then he talked about specific evidence. I have two responses. My evidence is really every economy ever. It's a basic economic principle that the free market is the best way to lower prices. Competition is the best way to lower prices. Government interaction is not the best way to lower prices. He said that we're not decreasing demand, or that our current system is increasing demand, and that's a bad thing. The problem is with the system that they're implementing, we're increasing supply. We're making an artificial market. But then my second response is 78% more expensive. This is something they didn't respond to in their last speech, saying that per ton, LRP use is 78% more expensive, completely dropped by the affirmative team. Then they talked about specifically how, when talking about that action has to be done, they said it's the purpose of our case. I actually have two responses. The first response is it's not mandated. I'd like to read the plan that they presented. It says, for the next fiscal year, the U.S. will purchase food aid in the recipient country when and where possible, as specified by LRP qualifiers. The reason why this is important is because it doesn't mandate that there has to be impact evaluation done. What it says is, when it's possible, do it. But the problem is it's based on the fact that our current system already does this impact evaluation, which is not something that is happening in the status quo, as the evidence said. They didn't really respond to this point. But my second response is that action is done. And I like to read the evidence to know exactly what we're doing in the current system. It says, complementing USAID's in-kind aid program, USAID is now the largest cash provider of food assistance in the world. I'd like to stop there. LRP is a cash program. What it does is it either buys the food or it gives cash out to the recipient so that they can buy the food themselves. This is the kind of program that we're talking about. A cash-based program is LRP. Then it says, it initiated the Emergency Food Security Program in 2010 to support local and regional procurement of food, as well as cash transfers and vouchers to address food security needs in emergency contexts. Using international disaster assistance funds, this program is used when USAID's in-kind food aid cannot arrive in time, or other forms of assistance are more appropriate due to market conditions. What it's saying is that these qualifiers that they're talking about are already used in the status quo. And the evidence that they presented saying that USAID wants their plan, guess what? That evidence, what the USAID was advocating for, has already been passed. USAID does not say that they want their plan. It said that they want reform that's already been done, showing that flexibility is still needed. Then they talked about specifically, they talked about the lobbyists, and they said exactly there's no lobbyists in the room. My one response is simply there's no proof of action. What I was saying here is not necessarily specifically that because the reason why LRPs aren't used in Title II specifically is because of these lobbyists. But remember, they're not actually mandating change. They're mandating they're mandating change based on impact evaluation. They still haven't actually proven that action is going to be taken. In fact, there's millions of dollars saying that action won't be taken. And that's really the point that we were trying to make. But then they talked about specifically, again, that it's not a cash transfer program. Remember, LRP is actually a cash transfer program. It's essentially buying food and then giving it to the people, or using cash and then using cash to either give to the people and then they buy food from those markets. Let's go on to the next speech. So really, all these said really against White's speech was this idea of total costs. In the evidence, it specifically talked about trucks and different delivery times. The point that White was trying to make is that that didn't take really into account the shipping costs, and we still don't know that, which leads to two voting issues. The first voting issue is that the plan is unnecessary. All of the advocates, specifically USAID, who they said is the expert on food aid, their plan that they want has already been passed. But not only that, the qualifiers that they're using is already being done, and the budget is actually increasing for that program, something they dropped. Voting issue 2 is that it's not solvent. They're not actually proving that the action is going to be taken. Right now, USAID doesn't do impact evaluation, and currently it's already being done. For these reasons, we believe the plan is not justified. Thank you.
Continuing affirmative prep time at 3 minutes and 10 seconds.
Would you mind if I had the USA fetch?
Yes, you know.
Thank you.
And the second page would be helpful as well.
Oh, yes, here you go.
Ending affirmative pro tem with 1 second. Wow.
Are all my judges ready? Excuse me. Items on the clock?
Yes.
Great, and let's go ahead and get started. 40,009 million. Judges, if there was one thing I would want you to take away, it'd be those two numbers. Here's why. 40,000 is the number of child's deaths that we can prevent by passing our plan, and 9 million is the number of people we can reach by using our plan. In this last speech, I'm going to be taking a step back and looking at the main arguments, the main concerns the negative team has with our plan, and seeing how they're actually not the case. And I'm going to be bringing up one voting issue of my own. But before I do, I want to bring up some conceded arguments in this round. First off, my partner, when he brought up his harm one under starvation, he brought up a quote from Brett Schaefer saying how only $1 of the taxpayers' money is actually, for every $1 of a taxpayer's money, only 35 to 40 cents are actually being spent on food aid. This was conceded by the negative team. Another conceded point by the negative team was the argument that I brought up in my speech, talking about how foreign people's food is better for them than in the United States. Because simply put, the United States can't be giving them food for the rest of their lives. No, the LRP helps them with the quality of the food, and ultimately their food, their own farms are better for them to be getting fed from. Alright, so with that said, let's get into some of the major concerns that the negative team has. First off, they talked about how we aren't going to actually be implementing our plan. And Judge, my response to this is 97%. 97%. The Government Accountability Office, as my partner brought up in his last speech and went conceded by the negative team, said this: we found that if CPFA requirements had not been applied, 97% of food aid tonnage after July 12th change in the CPFA requirement would have likely been awarded to foreign flag vessels. 97% of food aid, Judge, if we pass our plan, is going to be awarded to foreign flag vessels. The impact of this, Judge, is that we will have implemented change. This will go into effect. They also talked about, so that was responding to their argument of no proof of action. They talked about how we have in their first voting issue was that of plan is unnecessary, talking about how we have aid for non-emergencies. But Judge, simply put, we're dealing with non-emergency aid. Right now, we're talking about specifically is non-emergency aid. My partner brought up that source that said that the journey often takes, this is from USA Today, the journey often takes 7 months as the food moves from the Midwestern fields to the coastal ports, across the ocean, then by truck or even donkey to the intended recipients. By then, get this, judges, by then the food may be rotten or too late to be of much help. By then, the food may be rotten so the people can't eat it, or it's too late so the people can't actually survive on this food. The impact of this, Judge, is we need change, and our plan does actually solve for this case. Also, I want to talk a little bit about what LRP is. LRP is not a cash transfers. And I'd like to point out every evidence that they brought up about cash transfers and LRP said this: cash transfers and LRP. They specified the two. They had that coordinating conjunction in there. They had the and to specify cash transfers and then LRP. They're not the same. Also, LRP is essentially local and regional procurement. Is what we do here in the United States, food sourcing for the United States, but instead of doing it for the US, is actually buying from foreign farmers. So what this is actually doing, cash transfers, is giving people money to go and buy food. The US buys the food in LRP and then gives it to the people. It's not cash transfers. They also talked about how our plan doesn't actually say that we're going to have a change, and that we don't actually have any proof for this. And Judge, my response to this is LRP qualifiers. My partner talked about this. We're going to have USAID representatives in the benefiting country that are going to be doing this analysis. This is simply put already in our plan. We have this mandated. So when they're saying that, bring up this argument, they're actually ignoring our plan. They also talked about how USAID does not advocate for a plan. They talked about how in the 2014 Farm Bill, this bill was already passed. It wasn't passed, and I would like to bring you back to that 1AC that my partner read. 90% of food sourcing is from the US. That's not LRP, and this was a source from 2017, not 2014, but 2017. The impact of this is USAID fact sheet does stand, and the USAID fact sheet says that we will save 2 to 4 million people per year by passing our plan. So the impact of this, Judge, is going back into my final voting issue, my only voting issue, that is of lives saved. Ultimately, judges, we can save lives, as our evidence says. You see, Miriam Tsai had the opportunity, if we pass our plan, people like Miriam Tsai can put a pot of water on to boil and truthfully tell her children, I am in the middle of preparing supper.